Okay, we're going to talk about a Tompion clock watch. He's the man, if you haven't seen him before, this is a contemporary portrait, it's a mezzotint, but this was done in 1697. Now, I'm not going to go through this point by point, but if you don't know about him, there's a lot out there to see. He was born around 1639. We don't know exactly when, but he did die in 1713. So that's the time span we're looking at. A salient point in it, he did employ George Graham, who was never his apprentice from 1696, and he was in partnership later on. And Graham made a smart move. He married Tompion's niece, so it's always a good idea to marry the boss's relatives. It gets you a long way. But he did make something in the region of 700 clocks and around 5,500 watches. He did introduce sequence numbering of his clocks and watches. Some of the first balance spring watches around 1675 with Robert Hooke helping him. He invented a predecessor of the cylinder escapement and some repeating work. And he made the year-going regulators for the then new Greenwich Observatory. But his key was really that he combined sound business and marketing acumen with a great deal of technical expertise, skill in creative design, and he employed the very best craftsmen in all fields, including Huguenots. George Graham continued his legacy, and his lumbering, passing it on to in his turn to two of his own apprentices, Thomas Mudge and William Dutton. He's buried in Westminster Abbey, and George Graham, when he died in 1751, was buried with him. So this is what we're looking at. Not a very impressive looking watch. It's had a lot done to it. The cases, the dial and the hands are all later. But you'll probably notice that it's got winding from the front, which is not usual in English watches. But we'll see that later on. It's a pear case, so the inner case, which is called the box at the time, is quite pierced and elaborately engraved to let the sound out. We open it up and look at the movement, and there's quite an elaborate bit of decoration in there, and there's some features that we'll look at which may not be familiar. As you can see, it's not a repeater, but it is a clock watch, and a clock watch just strikes on the hour as it goes. There's no repeat function on these, or on this one, although there were some on some of the others. Very elaborate piercing and decoration on the balance cock and the cock foot, and on slide plate over here. It's, just bring up a. Everybody see the little red dot? Okay. Yeah.
Oh, where is it?
Right in the middle of the balance cock. Can you see it?
No.
Oh, there it is.
Oh,
There it is.
There he is. Yeah. Okay. Good. Got him. I can't make it any bigger, unfortunately. It's just a detail of the engraving at the foot of the cock. Later watches would have had a grotesque mask here, but these early ones, it seems to be either a young man or a young woman, or even an angel's face in here, which is much prettier, I think. I will note here that these pictures are mostly taken before it was dismantled and cleaned. So if you see cobwebs in there, that's not me, that's the previous chap that got to it. I'll just take you on a tour around the movement. You can see here the mainspring barrel and the chain and the fusee. Very elaborate tulip pillars. Here's the fusee, a little more detail. And being a verge, there's a contract wheel over here. This is the repeating side, or the striking side, I should say, of the movement. The strike barrel is quite elaborately pierced and engraved. It's affixed to the upper plate. It's not an ordinary barrel. It's what we call a standing barrel. And these rather elaborate steel pieces, we'll see later on, are part of the mechanism that controls the striking. This is what's between the plates. So over on the left-hand side, there's the normal three-wheel train for a verge of the time. And as you can see, there are 3 tulip pillars, but there are 2 others that are much thinner. They're vase baluster pillars, and they're there because there simply isn't room for tulip pillars with all this other mechanism, which is the striking train. And this lump under here is the hammer for the bell. This is the balance cock. Underneath, there is a small H stamped in it or scratched in it. Could have been for the person that actually finished it, but we don't know. Sometimes there's a serial number under there, but this one doesn't. Balance cock off, we see the balance wheel with its spring. Now the balance wheel is slightly unusual in that it's decorated slightly with these grooves, and it's also got what looks like a gold layer on the inner rim, which I'm not sure what that's for. I think it's just decorative. The balance spring is not original. The original one would have had far fewer turns than this, but this one keeps reasonable time, so that's what it's got. Remember, this is over 300 years old, so a lot of things have happened to it over those years. Taking the balance wheel out, you see a normal verge escapement with the 2 flags, and the whole thing is held on a collet in the wheel, and that collet also holds the balance spring collet. This is where it came from, and we can see here over on the right is the regulator, which is so-called Tompion, although he didn't invent it. And there's a gear wheel under here which moves this little slot round to regulate the length of the balance spring and hence the rate of the watch. This thing over here we'll go into a little bit more detail later, but that's the top of the barrel arbor for the striking work, and this is effectively stop work. It rotates so many times and then it won't go any further. Looking underneath that back plate, top plate, this is where the verge sits. It's called a potence, and the verge runs through the middle, and there are 2 pegs in there which are effectively the banking for the balance, because you don't want a verge to go rotating beyond where it's engaged. So we've got the 2 little pegs there that engage with the verge flags. And the escape wheel, which is running up here, pivots in that little hole there. This is all typical verge. This is the plate holding the regulator, which is called the slide plate. You see some of the screws are quite elaborate, and all this is really showing is that this is a solid silver piece and engraved and wax filled. And underneath you can see how when it was gilt, bits of it were missed. This was done with a mercury process where the gold was dissolved in mercury and coated on as a paste, and then it was fired to drive off the mercury, leaving the gold. Highly dangerous to the people that did it, because mercury vapor is not a very healthy thing to breathe in. It was quite lovely. These were in fashion in the early years of the 18th century, but they soon became superseded. This one, as you can see, has a sort of serrated middle piece, and that is separately implied. There's a pin here running through to hold it all in. But the other thing that this shows is the thickness of the gilding. It's really quite a lot of gold on there, which is probably why it's lasted so long. You can also see here where the pillar's been a little bit distorted, because this square here, which we'll see in a minute, is where the mainspring is set up. Fusees have to have a slight bit of pretension on the mainspring, or the fusee chain will fall off when it runs down. So this is the mechanism for applying that setup to the mainspring. There's a worm here, or a tangent screw, and it's turned by that little square on the end, and that engages with a toothed wheel that's squared onto the mainspring arbor. And winding that worm just moves that round, puts a little bit of tension on. This is the fusee. It's a little bit unusual with this early, and I think one of these clicks has been added because there are two clicks which enable the fusee to be wound without moving the rest of the train. Somebody thought it was a good idea, obviously, at some stage in its history, to add another one just to make sure. Because if that click fails, then nasty things happen. This is the rest of the train, only a three-wheel train. Typically with English watches at this age, the centre wheel isn't crossed out, it's just a solid wheel. Third wheel is crossed in three, and the contrary, which engages with the pinion on the escape wheel. It's had some previous repairs done. This solder repair to the contrary wheel is quite old. This is what's called the counterpotence that carries the follower, which is carrying the outer end of the escape wheel arbor. And as you can see, somebody's been a bit fierce with pushing that in and out because it's adjustable, and it's actually cracked the top of the counterpotence, and somebody has put a steel pin through and riveted it back together again. Just a little feature of its history, something you'd leave alone, obviously. Works perfectly well. So this is what's underneath the back plate. We've got the stop iron that stops the fusee being overwound and breaking the chain. There's the escape wheel, potence, the counterpotence, and this is the standing barrel for the strike. As you can see, it's been relieved here to give room to some of the wheels, and only the outside is actually engraved and ornamented. The inside doesn't need to be because it's never seen. And this is effectively the first wheel in the strike train. A few other little details. This is the mainspring barrel, and you can see how it's been soldered together here. And I believe this was how it's actually made. It wasn't turned up necessarily from a solid piece of brass, but would have been fabricated from strip, wrapped round and soldered together. See the little traces of solder in the lip there. The strike train barrel arbor, which is this square here, engages with that large wheel, which is just on a post. It's not connected to anything, but because there's a tooth gap missing here, it can only go around so far. So it works in the same way as Geneva stockwork or any other stockwork, to give you a limited amount of wind on that barrel. So now getting into the strike work, this is the hammer. That large wheel in the strike barrel arbor would sit behind this pillar. And then there's a train of gears, wheels, ending up with a single pinion that hasn't got a wheel. And the function of that is to regulate the speed of striking, because the depth of engagement of that with the previous wheel is adjustable. So the closer it is, the slower it goes. You can wind it out a little bit and the striking runs faster. A little bit clearer here what's going on. As you can see, the two narrow pillars have been relieved even further at the sides to allow room for everything to fit. And you can see down in this corner here, that is where that regulating pinion sits, and that plug is rotatable so that effectively you can alter the depth of the pinion into this wheel here. This chap up here is a pinion of 4. It drives the count wheel, which is how the striking is governed. These are just the components, including these steel pieces, which we'll come to in a minute. You can see that this wheel has a pin in it. There's another pin the other side. This wheel over here, with the pinion of 4 on the top of it, has the hammer lift pins. It has 8 pins, which are the hammer lifts. This is the hammer itself, and it's just a little detail really. The arbor of the hammer is really rather nicely done, and it matches the pillars it's next to, but it's fairly elaborate shape. This is the tail, which is lifted by those lift pins. This is the count wheel. If it was a count wheel, well, if it was a clock, you'd call it a count wheel. In this case, it's more usually called a locking plate. Solid silver with a brass toothed wheel riveted onto the back of it, which is driven by that thing. If you're wondering why that's not made in the normal way, because it's only a pinion of 4, you cannot cut a pinion of 4 in the same way as this, because if you did, all the leaves would fall off. So this is the other way of approaching it. It's sometimes called a pinion of report when you see it in some bracket clocks, and lantern clocks have these. It's just a neat way of making a pinion of 4. Looking at the dial side, there's quite a bit going on here. There's an hour wheel and a minute wheel, which are quite normal. And you can see the case bolt here. This thing round the edge is sometimes called a dial plate, sometimes called a brass edge. But in this case, it's not original. We'll go into that in a minute. Cannon pinion is pretty normal, except that it's got a snail cam underneath it. And this sprung lever in the third picture is following that. And as the cannon pinion revolves, it will slowly lift this lever, and at some point it will cause one of those steel gates that we saw earlier to move the warning gate and effectively put the strike train into warning in the normal way, and then we'll see what happens after that. The hammer, by the way, is down here. It's got a driving spring and a rebound spring. It's a normal way. Sorry, I'll go back. There. As you can see, that lever is squared onto an arbor. This is the other end of the cannon pinion with its snail. And that square is on the bottom end of the warning lever, the warning gate, which is this chap. There's a stop piece here, and this is the locking gate, which has a stop piece there. And this nib at the top is what interfaces with the count wheel. This is how it's all set up together. it's not easy to see what's going on. This is the pieces separately. They're rather beautiful pieces of steelwork and were originally blued, although it's some of it's rather worn off now. It pivots on this axis here. So let's go on and see what had to be restored, because it didn't fully work when I got it. First thing that struck is this rather nasty piece of brass wire that's doubling as a pillar pin and the bias for the locking gate into the count wheel here. You see it's meant to press that lever in. It's something that was done a long time ago, I think, when it was recased, but it's nasty. Looking around, I found another similar watch by Charles Gretton, who was a rough contemporary of Tompion's. And this, if you can see, it has a spring mounted down here, which is pushing the tail of that locking gate outwards towards us, and hence is pushing the locking nib here inwards into engagement with the pin on that wheel. So that spring is what should have been there, but somebody's done it, done a rather nasty thing and just put a bit of brass wire in there, so that wasn't acceptable. So what happens? That's just the axis of rotation of that gate. And that's the locking nib into the count wheel. And there's the spring. So looking at the pillar plate on the Tompion, we've got there's a hole, which is where that locking gate pivots. So now that's located it in terms of the locking gate. Here is a filed back foot. That angle has been cut back during manufacture because it was in the way of what should be there. We've got here a threaded hole with, at the moment, nothing in it, and a smaller hole that's not threaded, and that's also got nothing in it. So we've got potentially the makings of where a spring could be fitted. And that's what I did. Made a spring that fitted a steady pin there, screw there, and at the moment this is just straight. So it has to be curled round so that it ends up on the inside of the back of that locking gate. You notice that the spring itself is polished, but the screw is blued, and that's the normal way. If one component is blued, the other one is just polished. So this is the spring in situ. It fits in under here, under the barrel, and that's the axis of that gate. The spring is trying to push it, that end outwards, so it pushes that and that inwards and tries to engage that locking nib with the count wheel. So that's what's supposed to happen. However, when I came to test it, these are all the working parts. There's the bit the spring engages, there's the little nib that the pin on the wheel engages, and the locking nib for the count wheel. It isn't really apparent from this picture, but that nib had been soldered on in an earlier repair way back, and it basically fell off. So I had to replace that nib, cutting back the old steel to a good surface, making a new piece, silver soldering it in place. It looks horrible, but it was cleaned up. And that's the back of the thing after it was cleaned up. You notice there's a hole there. I put that there so that I could feed solder into it. It's a much better way of doing silver soldering if you can feed directly into the joint. So that hole is just a little place for the solder to run into. And once it's all cleaned up, then it's a lot narrower. Now, as a little example of what's actually happening when this thing runs, as that nib reaches the cutout, you'll see this lever drop in and it stops on that point. Another go. It's coming up to the cutout now. As it drops in, that pin there moves into the stop on the gate. Quite neat. Moving on to the fusee, it's had a very hard life. As you can see here, there are several holes where the hooking pin was, and it's been pulled out. Looking at it underneath, someone has cut out that recess to such an extent that it's gone right through into the cone. And you can see here 1, 2, 3, 4 previous attempts to plant the pin. What I had to do was move the pin slightly in towards the center so that it actually engaged both ends. You can just about see the pin under there. Not an unusual problem with these because the web of the fusee is quite thin. So there's plenty of metal underneath, but very little on top. So I had to plant that pin very carefully. Moving on to the case, when I put the bell back in and tried to test the movement, I couldn't get it to ring clearly. And what I found out was that the square in the middle here had been soldered back in at some point in the past and was now loose and had actually fallen out. It was a very poor repair because it was soft soldered and there's really little metal there to support it. So what to do? Apart from cleaning all that nasty solder off, because this is that case was made of gilt brass, make a new boss threaded that would fit into that hole. File it square because the bell is mounted on a square, and hard solder it in place. And then make a new screw, which you can see in the middle here, blued, to fit the new threading. So that was to really make sure that the bell wasn't going to move in the next 100 years or so. A few other bits and pieces. The balance cock screw as it arrived was a fairly nondescript thing. It was certainly not original. So looking around, I found a suitable pattern. I made the screw and blued it, polished it, blued it, which is much more in keeping with the style, as is this one, which was just cleaned up and polished and blued. The mainspring, the barrel had two holes in it, two hookings. The square one would have been the original one, and this round one was what was put in when the spring was put in. Now, I don't typically like to change these old springs if it's not necessary, and because this watch wasn't going to be run very often, I judged that it was appropriate to cut the spring back slightly and put a proper square hooking in, which was to go in that hole, and fill in the nasty new round hole with a brass plug. The hooking on the spring was made from rod. The rivet is turned up in the lathe and the rest of it's filed down and riveted into the newly formed hole in the end of the mainspring. It's the standard way that English mainsprings were fitted. It's just a bit of a pain to make a new hooking every time, but it was done. Moving on, the backplate pivot of the fusee for the going train had this rather nasty bush soldered in, and someone had cut a lump out of the side of the plate here, presumably in an effort to get the solder to flow in properly, which it did seem to have done, because underneath that backplate is a puddle of solder that's sort of holding that bush in. Really rather nasty. So what to do? Set up the front plate, the dial plate, in a mandrel headstock. Get the fusee pivot hole centered properly in the mandrel, using a wobble stick. Mount the back plate on its pillars and make sure that that is also centered. Bore out where that bushing was, and by doing it this way you make sure that everything's upright, because you don't want the fusee tilting at all. And friction fit a new bushing. The hole, nothing we can do about that really, we have to leave it. It's part of the history of the watch, but at least it's got a sound bushing now to run in. Now, at what the watches had done to it previously, it certainly wasn't, didn't arrive with me the same as it was, and it had left the workshop of Tompion. So what was altered, mentioned before, this brass edge. It's screwed to the pillar plate, which is absolutely wrong. How it would have, the original one would have been fitted into these slots, and this thing has been put to a second use. I believe it was originally fitted to a repeater of some sort, because it's got this funny cutout in it. Sorry, there. And these are the three slots. It's like a bayonet arrangement, which the original brass edge would have slotted into. Most normal watches would have had pillars and pins to fit that brass edge, and the dial was attached to that. But in this case, it's been rather messed around with. And the case, well, both the inner case and the outer case are not original. They're gilt brass, and there's leather coating. But the leather coating has been altered over the time as well, because not all these pins are present. There's other things have been done to it. So on the, it's quite a pleasant looking case, but it's certainly not original. It probably would have been gold. And the dial, I don't know if anybody's seen one of these before, with the arcaded minute chapter, but this is a typical style of the Dutch taste in dials. And whether this was fitted in Holland or was fitted by a Dutch worker in London or where it was done is impossible to say. The hands are not original. Although they're beetle and poker, they don't fit the dial terribly well. The hour hand is too long, and it's in a style that was really more current towards the end of the 18th century. And of course, the two collets around the winding squares. What it would have had originally when it was made would probably be something like this, which is a Champ-Levé dial. This is a silver one that was got traces of gilding on it. With a beetle and poker hands, but it's more likely that it was gold like this, and because it's got tulip pillars, it would probably have had a tulip hour hand like this and a rather different poker minute hand. This particular example is by Kipling, William Kipling, and it has in addition a date aperture, but there's no trace of that on the Tompion. So once it's been cleaned up and restored, this is it. One last thing. I noticed that when this count plate was locked at 6, it actually struck 8. So what was going on there? Well, having looked around at other Tompions, I found that this pin was not original. The plate would have been held down on its post by a sort of it's a sort of a cock, really. It's a pointer, and the tip of it is pointing to the number that's actually being struck. So that was a very quick tour through a really interesting piece of horology and a piece of history. So I shall stop sharing and ask if anybody has any questions.
It's going to the white seat. Yeah. There's a whole out here.
Yeah, that's really a fascinating presentation. The count wheel on this watch is the numerals that are stamped on it don't seem to all line up like you would normally expect on a typical count wheel. Can you explain a little bit more about that? I mean, it's like you have 1, 2, 3 up to about 8 or 9, and then finally you see the 12, but then something changes on there. Can you maybe explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's what I came to last. It's because those numbers are pointed to by that pointer. And when, as I said, when the pointer is striking to 8, it strikes 8. Those numbers are nothing to do with the cutouts in the edge of the wheel. They're related solely to that pointer. That's what's confusing. Does that answer your question, sir?
Kind of. I'll have to noodle it out a little bit. It all working so.
Question from the audience is, did you do everything yourself, work-wise on the movement?
Yeah. Yeah, just these.
I have a question. When you did the brass bushing, and you're dealing with a movement that's that old, do you ever have to determine maybe the metallurgy of the old brass versus the new brass you're putting in when you do it? That was not distracting.
I didn't. If it had been a museum original, See, my thinking with this is that it's had a lot done to it. It's been messed around a lot. I'm not messing around with it, but I'm still undoing what it's been messed around. So I had to do what I had to do. Um, I do know some restorers who will cast their own brass, but my other consideration was that that isn't visible. When the watch is fully assembled, that bushing is not visible. And if it's a choice between leaving it alone in a non-working state and doing something that might be a little bit, a bit off center, because watches are dynamic objects, and I think if they don't run, there's little point in them. They're just lumps of metal that can sit in a museum and be looked at, and nobody really knows what they're doing.
That runs, does that keep? What, how accurate is that watch? Within,
Verges have a terrible reputation for accuracy. I didn't fully work on it to get it back as in its factory original state, so to speak. I would expect a good verge to keep within 2 minutes a day. This one, depending on the state of wind, they are sensitive to the state of wind, even with a fusee in them. This one would probably do 3, 4, 5 minutes a day. Because again, I didn't change the mainspring. I didn't muck about with the depthing on the escape wheel and a few other things that could be done to make them more accurate. But a good verge will certainly go within 2 minutes a day.
question?
How do you set the watch? The time?
Set the time with the key on the square on the top of the cannon pinion. It's front set, effectively.
I'm intrigued by the lathe or the equipment to turn the parts. Now, obviously, some of the parts were hand cut and hand worked, but it had to be cut on some type of lathe. Would that have been a foot powered lathe or a bow lathe? You want to expound on
Would
that?
have been yeah, there would have been a dead center lathe of some sort, what we'd call the turns in the watch. Sometimes there would have been a bow, sometimes there would have been a foot treadle, sometimes there would have been an apprentice turning a wheel underneath the bench. But no, they certainly had lathes. They had dividing and wheel cutting engines of some sort. Although a lot of the finishing of the teeth on the wheels would probably have been done by hand. The wheels would have been divided, but in some sort of dividing engine, and possibly file cut by hand. It's apparent from looking at them. If you look very closely at the wheels in some of these watches, you can see tiny nicks at the root, where whoever's been doing it has marked where they've got to, so to speak. That surface has been finished, and a little tiny nick goes in on the root. But no, they had engines, they had lathes. It's just that the electricity wasn't there yet. And this, by the way, would have been done by, I suppose, a watch like this would have taken 30 or 40 different people to make it. It wasn't all sat up in a garret by one chap working by candlelight. It was done on a very much division of labour basis. But no factories then.
If he produced Tompion 5,500 watches, how many survive that are known?
Probably less than half. A lot have been lost. In terms of the numbers of this particular type of watch, it's known about 25 or 26 clock watches came out of his workshop. You've got to remember that the name on the signature in any English watch from, you know, dating right up to the 19th century. It was nothing to do with the people who made it. They were mostly for the vendor, the retailer. In the case of Tompion, yeah, he would have had an input to it, but he didn't do much of that work himself. He wouldn't have had time to make 5,500 watches. He was a very much an entrepreneur and a manager and a designer, and he used the best specialist craftsmen in the business.
You guess some of the work was done outside on clear days?
Sorry, say again.
You guess some of the work was done outside on clear days?
Yeah, he would send some work out, but he had a fairly big workshop. He had as many as 27 apprentices over his working life. Some of them, most of them, would probably have ended up working as journeymen for him. But there were other people, for instance, the people who made the mainsprings and put the springs in the barrels would probably be an outworker. That would be sent out to a chap round the corner, because the watchmaking district in London at that time and much later was Clerkenwell, and that area was absolutely solid with specialist workers. So you only had to go around the corner to find somebody that could do the job, and then the apprentice would bring it back when it was done and carry on with the rest of the work.
One final question, what would a watch like that cost? The person.
It's difficult to. It would have been probably around £100 at the time. Now you can look at various websites and look at what that equivalent is now, but it would be tens of thousands of dollars now. This sort of watch was something that only the very richest people could afford. If you look at some of the old newspaper records or the Old Bailey records, you'll see that a lot of watches are mentioned as being stolen and a reward being issued for their return. And the rewards can be £5 or £10, which was a lot of money then. So it gives you an idea of how much the value of the actual watch was. But they were very much a rich man's toy.
Is the majority of it engraved? I mean, I guess what I'm asking is it all engraved or is some of the cast filigree work? So
that would have been pierced and engraved by hand. At this level, they weren't cast. Some other elements, if you remember, there's in the middle of the Champlevé dial right at the end, the other examples like that Kipling. The center reserve of those would have been cast probably and then is finished. Some of the cases, again, not this particular case, if they were repoussé, you know, the hammered out decoration, that may have been cast initially, but again finished by hammering out. So yeah, it was. It probably wasn't worth anybody's while to cast them because they were all different.
all right. Anybody else? Well, we thank you for giving us your morning.
Well, it's my afternoon actually.
Yeah, the time difference, but we find the explanation fascinating. So thank you.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.